In the spring of 1994, 14-year-old Emily Price boarded a yellow school bus for an overnight trip in the Catskills. It was supposed to be just 2 days of campfires and forest hikes, a blur of laughter and cheap disposable cameras. She never came home. For 12 agonizing years, her mother lived trapped between hope and horror, until a lone hiker stumbled off the trail and uncovered something half-buried beneath pine needles. What he found would finally reveal the dark truth of what happened in those woods. And it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The spring of 1994 should have been bright and ordinary, the kind of gentle season where the hardest question was whether to pack a light sweater or risk the sunshine. 14-year-old Emily Price was buzzing with anticipation. It was her first overnight school trip, a 2-day environmental science camp nestled deep in the Catskills. There would be sleeping bags and ghost stories whispered by flashlight, marshmallows burnt to blackened sugar, and wide-eyed giggles echoing off the trees. Her mother, Lorraine, stood by the curb that morning, blinking back tears she tried to pass off as sunlight in her eyes. She fussed over Emily's too large backpack, making sure the zipper was fully closed, that her daughter hadn't forgotten the pack of trail mix or the new disposable camera she'd begged for all month. Emily just laughed, rolling her eyes with patient teenage indulgence. "Mom, it's not like I'm going to Mars. I'll be back tomorrow. Promise." Lorraine smoothed a stray strand of hair behind Emily's ear anyway, pressing her palm there for just an extra heartbeat, memorizing the warmth of her skin, the fine down of her hair. Emily climbed aboard the big yellow bus, already teeming with chatter and elbows nudging against windows. At the last moment, she turned and pressed her hand to the glass in a playful salute, her grin wide and careless. Then she was gone, swallowed up in a blur of other laughing kids, waving arms, and the squeal of tires pulling away. Lorraine never saw her again. Later, through tear-choked conversations with teachers and school staff, Lorraine pieced together the story, how the class had broken into smaller groups for a short nature hike on one of the park's winding trails, how Emily, always eager, always curious, had wandered just a bit ahead, stopping to crouch and photograph a patch of trillium blooms that dotted the forest floor like little white stars. How in the span of only a few minutes, she'd slipped out of sight. They called for her until their voices cracked, fanned out to search in frantic widening circles, hearts racing each time a bird took flight or a branch snapped underfoot. But there was only birdsong overhead and the slow, steady drip of last night's rain falling from saturated leaves. When the authorities arrived, they brought dogs that sniffed the air and set off eagerly, noses to the ground. But the faint trails always seemed to vanish at a tumble of mossy rocks or at the cold crossing of a brook, as if the forest itself conspired to swallow her scent. Helicopters droned low over the canopy, their rotor wash sending startled leaves into frantic spirals. Lorraine stood below them in the muddy clearing, head tilted up, hands clenched uselessly at her sides, hoping each circling pass would end with someone waving a bright scrap of Emily's jacket aloft in triumph. But they found nothing. Not a single footprint pressed into the soft black earth. Not a scrap of Emily's bright windbreaker snagged on a branch. Not even a candy wrapper from the treats Lorraine had tucked into her pocket that morning. It was as if the forest had simply opened up and taken her, closed its green, breathing throat around Emily, and left behind only the echo of her laughter to haunt the trees. Lorraine couldn't bear to leave their modest brick house on Hathaway Lane. It was more than a building to her. It was a breathing archive of who they'd been as a family. Every chipped corner and scuffed floorboard a testament to ordinary joys that now felt painfully rare. This was the same house where Emily had taken her first wobbly steps down the hallway, arms flung out like a tiny tightrope walker, squealing with delight when she finally collapsed, giggling into her mother's waiting arms. where homework battles had raged at the kitchen table, math sheets growing damp with frustrated tears, and then laughter when they finally solved the last stubborn problem. Where sleepovers had bloomed into wild conspiracies whispered under a quilt fort, Emily's friends shrieking whenever the floor creaked. Sure, it was ghosts. How could Lorraine abandon all that? And worse, what if, by some impossible grace, Emily found her way back? Thin and frightened, hair longer, eyes hollowed by years of terrible stories she might never be able to tell. What if she stumbled up the walkway, her sneakers torn, her knees scraped raw, and found only strangers standing behind the door? So Lorraine stayed. Emily's room remained untouched, a tender little museum of a life paused mid-breath. The bed was still neatly made with the same faded floral quilt, tiny roses climbing across the fabric like delicate, ghostly fingerprints. A single pink hairband rested on the dresser next to a cracked bottle of bubblegum nail polish, frozen in its slow evaporation. Her worn copy of Anne of Green Gables lay spine up on the nightstand, pages fanned slightly, a dried four-leaf clover marking the spot where she'd stopped, as if she might step back in at any moment to pick up where she'd left off. Every Saturday, Lorraine moved through the room with a hush that felt almost reverent. She opened the windows wide, even in winter, letting fresh air roll in, cold enough to sting her cheeks. The curtains billowed inward, a living sigh that made the faded wallpaper ripple. And for the briefest heartbeat, she could almost believe it carried Emily's laughter with it, bright and breathless, calling out from the yard below, "Mama, come look at this funny-shaped cloud." The neighbors across the street would sometimes pause while trimming hedges or carrying in groceries, eyes darting to Lorraine's open windows. They whispered that she was stuck, hopelessly adrift in grief. Their voices always dropped to conspiratorial hushes, as though sorrow might drift across the street like pollen and settle on their own neat lawns. Her sister came by often, voice soft with worry that was starting to fray at the edges. Therapy, she suggested again and again, or maybe just a weekend away. Fresh sights might loosen the knots in your chest, Lorraine. And always, inevitably, perhaps it's time to pack up Emily's room. Move the clothes out of the closet at least, so they don't hang there like small silent witnesses. But Lorraine only shook her head. Each well-meant suggestion landed on her like a gentle hammer tap against something fragile she held over her heart, as if testing it for weakness. Because the not knowing was a wound that never scabbed over, never dulled into something manageable. It throbbed differently from day to day, sometimes a sharp spike of panic, other times a long, hollow ache, but it never fully stopped bleeding. To pack away Emily's shirts and jeans, to fold her socks into neat, lifeless little bundles, to box up the red jacket that always made her daughter spin in the mirror and say, "Do I look cool, Mom?" It would be like signing a quiet, terrible contract with the universe, admitting to everyone else, and to herself most of all, that Emily was never coming home. And Lorraine couldn't do that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because so long as that room stayed waiting, bright with old sunlight, scented faintly of lilac drawer liners and girlhood dreams, there was still a place in this world for Emily to return to. 12 years later, in the early fall of 2006, a hiker named Sean Travers was weaving his way through a remote stretch of the Catskills, a wild, tangled section that didn't appear on any friendly tourist maps. He liked it that way. Out here, deer trails looped and forked unpredictably, threading faint labyrinths through brush and rock. Sean followed them wherever they led, chasing the hushed exhilaration of being truly alone in old, breathing woods. Here the trees were ancient. Their thick trunks were draped in velvet lichen, bark ridged like the folded hands of the very old. Above, their canopies twined so tightly together that sunlight struggled through in thin, trembling shafts, illuminating drifting moats like tiny spirits. Underfoot, a deep, springy carpet of needles silenced his steps, turning each footfall into a careful whisper that felt almost reverent. Every so often, a gentle wind stirred through, setting a slow shiver running through the high branches. Loose needles rained down in delicate curtains, their faint hiss the only sound beyond Sean's own breathing. He paused to sip water, sweat prickling cool on his neck. His eyes drifted lazily over the forest floor until they snagged on something that didn't belong. Just a few feet to his right, tucked into a shallow cradle of roots, was a tiny sliver of unnatural color. Bright, jarringly out of place against the muted tapestry of soil and moss. Sean squinted. It looked like cheap plastic. Frowning, he stepped closer and crouched, his pack sliding from his shoulder to thump softly against the ground. With tentative hands, he brushed away the pine needles and rotting leaf litter, sending up little bursts of musty, sweet decay. There, half swallowed by the forest's patient appetite, lay a backpack. Its fabric was blotched dark from years of damp and sun, seams loose, the zipper greened with corrosion. But on the top flap, beneath streaks of grime, was a name, still just barely visible in black marker: Emily P. A sudden chill rippled through Sean, lifting the hair on his arms. He didn't know why exactly, only that some primal instinct stirred awake, whispering that he was not meant to find this. His throat dry, he gingerly worked the stiff zipper open. It gave with a reluctant groan. Inside the bag was a fragile time capsule, the air inside stale and strangely cold. Sean's fingers sifted through crumbling remnants of school handouts, edges curled and blackened with mold that feathered up in tiny ghost blooms. A small plastic whistle still clung to an inner mesh pocket by a frayed red cord, the kind teachers handed out on field trips to keep kids from straying too far. It swung slightly when he nudged the bag, knocking faintly against the fabric with a tiny hollow note. At the very bottom was a spiral notebook, grotesquely swollen and warped from years of soaking and drying. Its cover felt almost slimy, stuck to the lining until Sean pried it free. It peeled back with a soft, tearing sound, like skin pulling from old glue. Many pages were nothing now, only eerie blue smears where ink had bled out in Rorschach blots and ghostly shadows. But some words had survived, pressed deep by a desperate hand. Sean's eyes flicked over the jagged lines, heart tripping painfully in his chest. I think someone is following me. I keep hearing snapping sticks. It's not the teachers. It's closer. He swallowed, tongue thick, turned the damp page with trembling fingers. Deeper in the book, the pencil strokes were so hard they nearly tore through the paper. If anyone finds this, tell my mom I didn't just run away. Please. A strangled breath escaped Sean's lungs. He let the notebook fall shut, his hand coming up to press against his mouth. The quiet woods around him suddenly felt impossibly close, every rustle and faint crack of settling branches turning sharp, suspicious. He stood slowly, the backpack dangling from his hand like dead weight, a relic too heavy with ghostly voices. His gaze swept the tangled underbrush, half expecting, half dreading, to see someone standing there just beyond the screen of trees, watching. But there was only emptiness. The hush that wrapped around him was no longer peaceful. It felt thick, complicit, like the forest itself was holding its breath, guarding the last, fragile echoes of a terrified girl's plea that had waited 12 long years to be heard. Sean backed away, the backpack clutched tight against his chest. His steps were fast now, crunching through the pine duff, eager to put distance between himself and whatever ancient secrets these woods might still be keeping. Authorities contacted Lorraine within days of the discovery. It was late afternoon when the patrol car pulled up outside her house, its engine ticking into silence. The sun was already sinking behind the rooftops, staining the narrow street outside her window a soft, indifferent gold. It was the same gentle light that had once spilled across Emily's chalk drawings on the front walkway, warming stick figures that never seemed to last more than a rain or two. Lorraine watched from behind the thin lace curtain as two sheriff's deputies stepped out. They moved with the quiet, deliberate gravity of men who dreaded the burden they carried. By the time they reached her door, her breath had already quickened, a deep, trembling dread blooming low in her chest. She led them into the kitchen, hands twisting together to keep them from visibly shaking. It was the same little kitchen where Emily used to sit after school, her legs swinging idly beneath the chair, tongue poking out in concentration over spelling words. Lorraine could almost hear the ghost of her laughter in the faded floral wallpaper. The deputies spoke in careful, measured voices, the kind reserved for delivering news that might fracture someone. Their words blurred into a kind of hollow echo, her mind refusing to accept them fully. Then one of them gently laid the faded backpack on the table. Lorraine's breath hitched violently. Her hands rose on instinct, hovering inches above the worn fabric, fingers spread wide as though the very air between her skin and the backpack might sear her. She stayed like that for long, unsteady moments, heart knocking painfully against her ribs. What if touching it made it all too real? What if some small part of Emily still clung to it, sweet and warm, only to vanish the instant Lorraine's hands closed around it? Finally, a soft sob lodged itself so tightly in her chest she thought it might choke her. Her palms descended and settled on the pack. The fabric was stiff with age, the edges frayed and brittle. It was cold, cold from the deputy's hands, from the long chain of evidence rooms it had passed through. Her fingers fumbled until they found the zipper pull, and there, dangling just where it always had been, was the little purple dolphin keychain Emily had won at the county fair. Its cheap plastic surface was scratched dull, one tiny painted eye chipped away. But somehow it had endured, clinging to the zipper through all those lost seasons. A sound, half laugh, half gasp, broke from Lorraine's throat. She pulled the backpack to her chest and curled around it, as if trying to shelter something small and breakable. A faint scent rose up, the smell of earth and mildew and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like the ghost of Emily's old strawberry shampoo that had clung on through a dozen brutal winters and soaking rains. Lorraine began to rock, the motion utterly instinctive. It was the same gentle swaying she had used to soothe Emily through childhood fevers, to calm her after thunderstorms split the sky. The memory of Emily's small hands gripping her nightgown in the dark made Lorraine's shoulders fold in on themselves. And then the memories flooded in, too sharp, too bright. Emily giggling and begging for just 5 more minutes before lights out. Her delight the first morning snow blanketed the yard, when she ran outside, still in pajamas and boots too big. The shy way she'd tucked her hair behind her ear, cheeks glowing crimson as she told Lorraine about the boy in her homeroom, the one who scrawled, "I like you," on a torn scrap of notebook paper and left it in her locker. Tears fell freely, dark spots blooming across the canvas of the old backpack. Lorraine pressed her cheek to it, whispering into the fabric. "I knew she didn't run," she breathed, the words small but made fierce by 12 years of lonely conviction. "I always knew she didn't just leave. My baby would never leave me like that." The deputies stood quietly by, heads bowed, hands respectfully folded in front of them. They didn't try to hurry her or fill the silence. Outside, the neighborhood went on untouched. A dog barked a few houses down. A car door slammed with the casual finality of people moving through their ordinary lives. But inside that dim kitchen, time collapsed. Lorraine rocked in a tide of sorrow that was somehow softer now, simply because the long, terrible question of where had finally, heartbreakingly, been answered. It wasn't the answer she'd once prayed for, but it was an answer all the same. And even that dark certainty was kinder than the endless, gnawing torment of maybe. The local sheriff's office wasted no time bringing in state investigators. Soon, unmarked SUVs lined the narrow gravel roads near the trailhead. Strangers in windbreakers with notebooks and evidence kits stepping carefully through the underbrush. Cadaver dogs moved like silent ghosts among the trees, noses low, tails stiff with grim purpose. For days the woods were alive with searchers again. The kind of tense, methodical searching Lorraine remembered from the first awful weeks after Emily vanished. Only this time, they weren't hoping to find a frightened girl hiding under a hollow log. They were looking for remains. It was 3 days later, under a sky threatening early snow, that a team found what they were after. Near where Emily's backpack had been discovered, a cadaver dog started barking sharply at an old rotted log half sunk in moss and leaf mold. When they carefully rolled it aside, the earth underneath yielded fragments of bone, pale and porous, and scraps of faded fabric that once might have been Emily's cheerful windbreaker. DNA confirmed it days later. Lorraine took the call in her living room, phone pressed tight to her ear, knees folded up under her on the couch like a child bracing for a scolding. The confirmation squeezed the last fragile wisp of hope from her lungs. But that wasn't all. A deeper search of the surrounding area uncovered something else. Small metal charms, crudely stamped with odd symbols, tied to lengths of weather-stained twine. They'd been arranged in a loose, rough circle around where Emily's remains lay hidden. Each little figure was twisted just slightly differently. Some had stick arms, others tiny punched-out holes like eyes. When the sheriff's department realized what they were seeing, they called in a forensic anthropologist from Albany, a thin man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes who had studied similar backwoods ritual sites. He sat across from Lorraine at her kitchen table, turning one of the charms over and over in gloved hands, as if weighing whether to tell her the full truth. "This wasn't an accident," he finally said. His voice was gentle, but beneath it was the heavy drag of someone who had delivered too many ugly revelations. Someone set these intentionally. These are old folk symbols, protection charms in some traditions, offerings in others. The patterns suggest this was ritual space. Your daughter may have simply stumbled into something she was never meant to see. Lorraine's hands clutched the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles blanched. The walls seemed to lean in, the room tilting in her vision. Her breath stuttered, heart racing in small, painful jolts. For years, she had begged for any answer, any scrap of what had happened to Emily. Friends told her that someday she'd find peace, that knowing would at least end the awful uncertainty. She never imagined that when the truth finally came, it would be so dark. Emily's funeral was quiet, almost painfully so. Just Lorraine, a few cousins who held each other's hands in tight knots, and a scattering of Emily's old school friends, now young adults with solemn faces and damp eyes, clutching tissues in gloved hands. They gathered at Rose Hill Cemetery under a bruised October sky, the clouds swollen with the threat of rain that never quite fell. The air carried a faint bite, whispering of winter waiting just beyond the horizon. As the small white casket was gently lowered into the earth, dry leaves loosened by a passing breeze came tumbling down around them. They twirled in languid spirals before settling across the fresh dirt and the bowed shoulders of mourners, as if the trees themselves were shedding tears. Lorraine stood very still at first, her hands clutched together so tightly they ached. Then she slowly sank to her knees, skirts gathering damp from the cold ground. She reached out and pressed her fingertips into the raw soil until they tingled with chill. "You're home now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the rustle of the trees. "I won't wait by the window anymore. I won't keep the porch light on. You can rest. And so can I." Her tears came soft and silent, sliding down her cheeks to drip onto the dirt that now held her daughter. They weren't the harsh, racking sobs of those first awful years, when grief was a wild animal clawing at her throat. These tears were almost tender, worn smooth by too many sleepless nights spent imagining every possible ending, every dark corner of possibility. Now, at least she knew. And even though the truth was cruel, darker than any nightmare she dared to whisper to herself, it was still gentler than the endless ache of maybe. The ache of not knowing had carved hollows in her, left her fragile and thin. This truth, terrible as it was, laid a final stone on that gaping wound, giving her something solid to lean against at last. As the mourners began to drift back toward the waiting cars, Lorraine remained by the grave a little longer, whispering small, private things into the cool air. When she finally stood, brushing dirt from her palms, her shoulders slumped but also somehow lighter. And for the first time in 12 long years, she walked away without glancing back over her shoulder, carrying with her the bittersweet mercy of knowing. Some losses carve their marks so deep that even time can't smooth them away. They linger in quiet rooms, in the hush just before sleep, in the way we flinch at laughter that reminds us of voices we'll never hear again. If this story stayed with you, if it left a shadow in your thoughts or a catch in your breath, share what it stirred in you down below. And don't forget to subscribe for more haunting true crime narratives and the dark, hidden truths they so often reveal. Because sometimes, the only peace we ever find isn't in happy endings or bright tomorrows. It's simply in finally knowing, even when the knowing hurts.